This is Positive Parenting. Parenting expertise and advice from best-selling parenting author and national newspaper columnist, Mr. Dad, Armin Brott.
Good morning and welcome to Positive Parenting. I'm Armin Brott. You know, statistics show that 4 out of 10 8-year-olds in the United States cannot read independently. To a large extent, that's really the result of a lack of exposure to words in their earlier years. The truth is that confident readers are not born, but they can be made naturally, lovingly, and joyfully by a child's first reading teacher, and that's you. Hopefully, you've got a pretty good idea about just how important reading and writing are for your child's success. But even if you don't, we're going to be getting to that over the course of this show. But whether you're a parent, a grandparent, or some other kind of caregiver, you want to be sure that your child's literacy is developing appropriately. But unless you're a literacy expert, you probably don't know how to teach reading. It's likely that you don't know what your child's reading, writing, and spelling should look like from birth through age 7, or how to even recognize when literacy may not be developing normally. Well, we're going to be talking about all of that in today's show because, as I touched on a little bit earlier, when it comes to language, the most critical brain growth happens in early childhood. The key, as you might guess, is to introduce the right activities at the right time. So whether you've got a brand new baby, a toddler, a preschool, or a kindergarten, or even a first or second grader, you're not going to want to miss any of this. So stay with us.
Now, get ready for more positive parenting with Armin Brott from the MrDad.com radio network.
Welcome back to Positive Parenting. I'm Armin Brott, and my guest for today's show is Richard Gentry, who's the author of Raising Confident Readers, How to Teach Your Child to Read and Write from Baby to Age 7. Richard, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Armin.
You know, reading is absolutely, in my view anyway, one of the most important things you can do with your kid. I mean, there's all these pieces of research, and we've talked about them a lot on the show, about the sort of disproportionate number of people who are in jail who have reading problems and people who have not healthy lives who have reading problems. And also on the other side of it, that having adequate reading skills makes you better prepared for school, bigger vocabularies, and kind of sets you on the road towards a more successful life. Is that kind of why you got into this?
Well, that's right. I'm a former professor of reading education and director of a reading center. But what I found out was that there are many positive advantages of starting early with kids. So for the last 3 years, I made that my central focus. What parents can do early has huge implications for success with reading later on.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that in hopefully some good detail about what it is exactly we can do. One thing that really intrigued me, though, and this is a little out of order, but you say in the book that scribbling is just as important as reading out loud. Can you explain that? Well,
it's very important because what happens with kids who are in the first phase of learning to read from birth to usually around age 3 is that in addition to all the other advantages of reading aloud with kids, if you begin art activities and letting them draw, what they're doing is they are actually delving in symbolic representation. And for many kids, they actually write first and read later. That is, they learn to write their name before they actually learn to read. And writing the name, in fact, is a big leap forward, a kind of a giant cognitive leap in terms of kids' understanding of print and how it works.
Okay. Well, let's talk about from the very youngest ages. Just as I was looking through your book, reading through your book, remembered an interview that I did with a guy years ago who has a whole program about teaching babies to read, and he has some evidence that he says, anyway, we're teaching kids as young as 6 months old to read. And it was hard to tell whether it was actually kind of pattern recognition, whether you can see CAT as an object or whether they're actually reading the word cat. But when do you think is the right time to start with kids?
Well, the right time to start reading aloud to kids is immediately after birth. For example, the baby can recognize the mom's voice within about 3 days. And what's happening when parents read aloud with a child that early is that they're taking in data, and they're beginning to set down the brain circuitry for language. But a lot of other good things are going on too. The reading aloud helps parents to bond with their kids, and social and emotional development is happening. And even things like motor skills. Babies begin to first explore the book with their mouth, but pretty soon they will be turning the pages. It's interesting, as early as 6 to 9 months of age, babies can link sounds with objects and concepts. As early as 4 months of age, they can remember colors, bold colors like red, blue, green. So seeing illustrations is so important. But the big key is language development, and the thing that reading does beyond just allowing kids to take in words from listening to someone talk is that reading introduces what researchers call rare vocabulary. It greatly increases the number of words that children are exposed to. Words, for example, like elephant or giraffe or hippopotamus, wouldn't normally come up in everyday conversation. And it's amazing. Babies in the first 3 years, each year, they're exposed to about, if they're read aloud to and talked to a lot, they're exposed to about 10 million words a year. So It's just incredible.
Wow.
And the thing is, these babies who are read to and talked to early on, by the time they're 6 years old, they have vocabularies of 13,000 words. And by the time they're in fourth grade, they are more intelligent. They have better grades in reading, writing, and spelling.
Now, there's something that comes up quite a bit. I've heard this from several teachers, and I've actually received some emails myself along these lines, that some parents don't feel that they can read aloud to their kids because they have some reading issues on their own. They've never been particularly confident readers, or they may have dyslexia or some other kind of a learning issue, and they don't want to either pass that on to their child, or they're embarrassed, or maybe their English language skills aren't that good. What do you tell people like that as far as the necessity and the importance of reading, no matter how you do it?
Well, the books that parents start with are the classic nursery rhymes and picture books, and they're books that I think that almost any parent could be comfortable reading. And it's in a situation where a parent might not be able, for example, English with English language learners, a parent might not be secure reading English. Then I think the thing to do is to find a caregiver who can help the parent out and provide this very important experience.
All right, let's talk about infants. So you've said you start reading from the very beginning. Can you recognize way early on whether there's a problem that your child is going to have, or is that something that really is going to come up later on, as far as whether there's a budding learning disability?
Well, there are a few signals early on. For example, really, really late speaking is sometimes associated with later problems.
You're talking about past what age? I mean, how are you defining really late speaking?
Well, I don't want to alarm parents, so I would cluster. I wouldn't give a specific age, but I would cluster a number of specific things to look for, and I would say, if you notice these things, see your pediatrician. Another thing is after babies begin speaking, having difficulty with recognizing rhyming words, and once children start to once they can write their name, severe difficulties with spelling are some of the earliest signs. But babies are so smart. I think parents should focus not so much on what their babies aren't doing, but what they're able to do. And you mentioned earlier having had a guest who talked about babies who could read as early as 6 months of age. Babies can recognize words,
right?
And which I think is, in fact, for very young children, birth to age 3, I have an activity called reading around the room, labeling objects. And one of the things that parents do is they do what's called finger point reading. If they label objects like the bed, or colors like red, or a picture of mom, a picture of dad.
Richard, let me stop you there for just a second. We got to take a quick break.
Sure.
Talking with Richard Gentry, the author of Raising Confident Readers, and we'll be right back with more with Richard.
Now, get ready for more positive parenting with Armin Brott from the MrDad.com radio network.
Welcome back to Positive Parenting. I'm Armin Brott, and we're continuing our discussion with Richard Gentry, the author of Raising Confident Readers, How to Teach Your Child to Read and Write from Baby to Age 7. Just before the break, you were talking about reading around the room and going around the room and labeling everything. Finish that thought.
Sure, and what it's even possible that kids sometimes are able to, if parents do that and track the sounds like bed, bed, and point from left to right as they read the word bed. Some babies can recognize the words even before they can speak them. So it's interesting, if you're reading aloud a book like Elmo's Blanket, the research shows that babies sometimes recognize a word 5 months before they can say it.
There's a great book that my daughter used to love to read. It was one of the Arthur books, and there was a little bit of a situation. I'm sure most people have seen Arthur, the cartoon, and then his little sister's DW, and she was making a bet that she could read, and she was much too young to be able to read, but she was pointing out various things like pizza or zoo or wet paint and things like that she had learned, obviously, to see the word zoo and understand what that meant. And so there is, exactly what you're saying, a certain kind of pattern recognition that it just registers. And so the Z-O-O, they may not understand that that's Z-O-O, but they understand that that combination of squiggles means, animals are in there.
That's right. Many of the first words they recognize, I think, as a pattern or as a whole word. But if parents answer their questions, and they'll soon. And one of the advantages of writing is if they begin to pretend to write and then move into drawing pictures and attempting to write about them. They ask lots of questions, and pretty soon they'll figure out how sounds work with words.
Right. And
that's exactly what I show in the book, how kids actually go through phases in breaking the alphabet code. What I do in the book is provide the appropriate kinds of activities for particular phases.
Well, let's talk about some of those things. So how does it go generally from not really recognizing any letters to being able to kind of recognize the letters and do what you're talking about, the cracking the alphabet code? What's the age progression roughly? I mean, take us through a minute or two.
Oh, sure. Well, phase 0 would be from birth to age 3, up until the child learns to write his or her name. The next name is the next phase, rather, phase 1 would roughly be from ages 3 to 5, depending on how soon parents start and the amount of exposure, informal exposure to literacy that they have at home. But what represents phase 1 would be something like a grocery list. The child can write her name, and she pretends to write a grocery list, but what you would see is just random letters. So she doesn't yet recognize that letters correspond to sounds. Mm-hmm. Then they would move to a phase where they are beginning to match letters with sounds, and this phase, generally, the first thing the parent would see would be beginning letters. So you might see a picture of Humpty Dumpty, and the writing with it would be HMTDPD. The next phase would be phase 3, and it's a letter for sound. So you can a parent can actually, without the picture, read what the child is writing. For example, bird might be spelled B-R-D. The phrase "Are you deaf?" might be spelled R-U-D-F. And then finally,
there's no difference between that and teenagers who are texting. It's the same thing. There we are.
It's the same kind of abbreviated spelling. The problem is that English doesn't work a letter for a sound. English works in chunks of phonics patterns or spelling patterns.
Right.
And what has to happen, not only does spelling instruction, or not only will kids learn to spell a lot of words correctly as they are engaged in the activity of drawing and writing stories, but ultimately they move to the last phase, which is the chunking phase. A word like everywhere, for example, might be spelled ev, E-V, re, R-E, where, W-H-A-I-R, with the air chunk that they might recognize from airplane.
Sure.
And that's,
that seems like a good sign.
What's that?
That seems like a good sign.
Yeah,
they're getting the sounds. Yeah,
it's a great sign. But once kids are in school, it's also the sign that one of my major tips for parents is of school-age kids is to look in their book bag and make sure they've got a spelling book. But one of the things that's happened in America that really disturbs me is that spelling has been given short shrift, and too many kids are struggling readers because they haven't the foundational spelling knowledge.
Richard, when do you think is an appropriate time to push kids towards reading? I know that there seem to be in preschools, for example, and kindergartens, very different theories about this. I mean, some are very academic and they're pushing kids to be reading pretty well by the end of kindergarten, and some are saying kindergarten is kind of still an extension of preschool, and it would be nice if they know their letters, but we aren't expecting them to read or write anything. Is there an optimal time, or is there a time when parents should be really pushing, or do we kind of let them come to it on their own?
Well, I think the notion is not push or not push, but the thing for parents to recognize is the difference in formal and informal instruction. What's happening, all the recommendations in my book are for informal instruction, and it's all joyful and fun. There's no pushing whatsoever. What we know from how the brain develops is that the frontal lobe doesn't develop until about age 6. So the kinds of requirements for formal instruction don't work well with kids who are younger than that, because their brains aren't developed well enough, and also they don't have the stamina for formal formal reading lessons, or to follow adult kind of reasoning. So it's very important to recognize in this push versus not push debate
Yeah.
That what we're talking about for kids who are kindergarten and preschool is informal instruction.
Well, we only have just a minute left, but I do want to definitely ask you this about kids who don't feel confident. I've got a 7-year-old, and I trade her off every night. We do reading together. I read her a chapter of something, and she reads me something, and she's got to be reading for 15 minutes a night. But there was a time when she just had kind of convinced herself she didn't know how to do it, and she couldn't figure it out. She's actually very good and sounds things out quite nicely. But what do you do with a child who either doesn't have the confidence or doesn't have the actual skill to read out loud themselves? How do you encourage that?
Well, I think one of the major things is to compliment and not correct them. Parents often tend to feel an urge to correct every mistake, but that's one of the ways that kids might lose confidence. And sometimes it's good to always allow kids to choose their books. Very young kids to choose the books that they want to read, and even if you've read it 200 times and you're ready to move on, kids will benefit from the repetition of rereading that book, and
Right.
they'll be fluent, and that'll help them gain confidence.
Richard Gentry is the author of Raising Confident Readers, How to Teach Your Child to Read and Write from Baby to Age 7. Terrific book. All sorts of wonderful exercises and other things in there. Richard, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. My pleasure.